Welcome back. Professor V. Krishna Ananth is with us here again, and thank you so much, Hyman, for joining us, Hyman. Uh, uh, Last time we were discussing about his recently launched book, Between Freedom and Unfreedom: The History of Press in Independent India, and the discussion has actually ended where Professor Krishna Ananth was talking about you just started. I mean, what emergency has sort of done to the press, and in fact, we were going back and forth. We also discuss that how important, significant was the report of First Press Commission in terms of understanding the journey of press in the post-independent India. Let me so put forth a question from where we left last time. In your book, Professor Krishna Ananth, you have in fact went in you have gone in a great detail uh, uh, regarding the episode of emergency and how press was muzzled by the state, and the reaction from the proprietors, and a certain kind of camaraderie among the journalists uh, who lined up against the state and took the call of journalism, irrespective of which newspaper they were representing. And in fact, you call it India's drift towards unfreedom. So how the press was affected during the emergency? I mean, could you just elaborate on it? And this, in fact, I found very interesting. What you call it, India's drift towards unfreedom.
Now, I think, the emergency, I mean, just to sort of, keep reminding all of us again and again, uh, was in fact, the consequence of a provision in the democratic constitution. In fact, Article 352 of the constitution provides for a retreat to unfreedom. In fact, the constitution that guarantees freedom also provides a constitutional provision that, all these freedom can actually sort of, take a back seat. And, the society, the polity, and including the press can actually be taken into some kind of a stage of unfreedom. So the emergency actually sort of, there were emergencies before, in fact, the external emergencies once again in the context of the war with Pakistan, did not really sort of, make an impact as much as the emergency of 1975 made on the press. And at some level, like, it happened at a point of time when the press was beginning to sort of, find its bearing, particularly as an adversary to the government, raising questions against, and it was more of a political kind of churning that was happening. And in fact, in my book, I sort of, explain the threat to press freedom, or sort of, the threat to sort of, the constitutional guarantees of the free press, to the free press, in two distinct categories. One is legal but illegitimate, and another threat came and was executed by means that were illegal and quite naturally illegitimate. The illegal is something that I think anybody who's familiar with the emergency knows it, that on the night, even before the emergency was declared, rather sort of, even before the president signed on the dotted lines, when President Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad signed the proclamation of emergency, it was round about past 10:30 in the night on the 25th of June 1975. Even before that, in fact, the emergency regime, and this is a word that I use in the book, the emergency regime. It's not about a government; it was the regime. They actually switched off electricity supply to the newspaper officers on the Bahadur Shah Zafar Marg. to ensure that the newspapers were not printed. And why was it important for them not to print and circulate? Well, there were two things. One is, just a few hours before that, around about 5:30 or 6:30 in the evening, the combined opposition, all the opposition parties to the Congress had assembled a huge rally at the Ramlila Maidan, where they actually come out with this joint struggle committee with Moraji Desai as its chairman, Nanaji Deshmukh as its general secretary, to sort of intensify the struggle against Indira Gandhi continuing as prime minister in the aftermath of the Allahabad High Court judgment disqualifying her. Now, between that time and the time that President Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad signs the proclamation, the regime had prepared a series, a whole bunch of arrest warrants to put all these opposition leaders behind bar, and they did not want the newspapers to be printed, one to report about what happened at the rally on the Ramlila grounds, but more importantly, the newspapers shall not actually report the arrest of a whole lot of opposition leaders. So in fact, this was something illegitimate. They switched off the electricity supply by getting the Delhi municipal, and the Shah Commission subsequently documents all these things as to who gave the then Lieutenant Governor of Delhi. Had actually sort of admitted that he had issued instruction to the Delhi Municipal Corporation, and the Justice Shah Commission says that such an order itself was illegal. I mean, an order like that could not have been issued. Now, yet the newspapers that were located outside the Delhi Municipal Corporation area, that is in NDMC, that is Hindustan Times and Statesman, are beating this illegitimate and illegal activity. And Hindustan Times is about to be printed. B.G. Verghese, he actually, so one was that illegitimate and illegal, blatantly illegal way of switching off electricity to the newspaper officers in the Delhi Municipal Corporation. Now, outside of the DMC, that is in the NDMC, there is the Hindustan Times and the Statesman, which are not sort of, suffering this power outage, and newspapers are printed. B.G. Verghese actually wakes up from home, comes to his office to print the newspapers, and that is again frustrated by the Birlas actually getting the trade union, a pro-Congress trade union, to stop printing. So in some sense, the emergency, and subsequently, 3 days down the line, there is the censorship guidelines. Now every newspaper is categorized into as friendly, unfriendly, hostile, and so on and so forth. And we have documented evidence of that. That is something that is, I think, that is also the reason why I say that India's drift to unfreedom. Now this is where I think not just the press, the kind of censorship regulations that were in place, it ensured that nothing that the press was meant to do, that is to speak against not to speak against the regime, but even to tell the people as to what is happening around them, to tell the people that the constitution has been sort of manhandled, was not allowed to take place. And this, the first 3 days it was done illegally and illegitimately, but even after the censorship guidelines were issued under the Defense of Internal Security Act, the Defense of India rules were now converted, as sort of amended to be the Defense of Internal Security Act. Now, all those rules, even if they were actually sort of the procedure established by law was followed, the fact these were illegitimate in the sense that the core of Article 19(1)(a), that is the right to free speech and expression, was completely muzzled, was destroyed, and the press was made into some kind of a spokesperson, a handmaiden of the regime of the time. So that, I think, is a very, very important fact that sort of I call it India's retreat to unfreedom.
So, a question A follow-up question onto that. I mean, something which obviously, I mean, you end your book with the answering that question. Does the media still remains sort of vulnerable to such pressures which come from the state, particularly even in the post liberalization era, where the general sort of consensus is that liberalization brings freedom from the state also?
Well, I think, I mean, let me put it this way. And that is where I think it's very important for us to sort of, I mean, look at the lessons learned during the emergency, one by the democratic polity as such, but more specifically the press. In fact, in the 1980s, I would actually call it like, the glorious era of, let's say, the press in India, not just because like, the press talked about, wrongdoings by the government. I mean, that is, I mean, Arun Shourie blazes a trail, but this is also a period when there is the higher judiciary, the Supreme Court, and various high courts also, but most importantly that the Supreme Court plays a very, very proactive role in deepening democracy. And what I would call is like, there was the press and the judiciary working in some kind of what we can call a jugalbandi, like they work together in terms of deepening democracy. I mean, I think the book I have talked about in elaborate detail about how Neerja Chowdhury does unravel the dynamics, or the sad state of those who were released from bonded labor, being bonded labor, and how the Supreme Court, in fact, Neerja Chowdhury writes a letter to the judge, to the then Chief Justice, a suo motu public interest litigation is taken up to make this order, saying that mere release and sort of I mean, freeing the bonded labor from bondage is not sufficient. Article 21 of the Constitution mandates that they should be rehabilitated. Or, there is this famous what do you call case of a law, particularly on the right to life, that is Olga Tellis and others versus the Bombay Municipal Corporation, where the fate of the slum dwellers are taken up. Where I mean, subsequently, you have the media talking about, the rights of the prisoners. You have Ashwini Sareen of the Indian Express talking about, how flesh trade is so rampant, not too far away from the national capital. And all these things, there is some kind of, a symphony. The press actually sort of, I mean, initiating something, and, there is a harmonious collaboration by the judiciary, the higher judiciary, in terms of deepening democracy and all. And in some sense, like, that unravels two things. One is that the press had understood, learned its vulnerability in terms of, insofar as the state actually muscling its own freedom. The judiciary also sort of, comes to, incidentally, for two of the judges who were men who were pronounced guilty by society in the habeas corpus case, the ADM Jabalpur movement, Justice Y.V. Chandrachud and Justice P.N. Bhagawati. Both of them actually sort of, were with the majority in the habeas corpus case. And two of them, one after the other, Chandrachud first and then Bhagwati after that, become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And they play a very proactive in deepening democracy and with the press. So in some sense, that was a moment when the vulnerability was understood. Then, the exit option or the way out was also understood. The press actually sort of, realizing its own important role in democracy. And which again, to me, I think, the best part of it was in August 1988, when the then central government headed by Rajiv Gandhi, with the monster majority in the Lok Sabha, 415 MPs in the Lok Sabha, not being able to push through what it actually wanted to smuggle in, called the Defamation Bill, which I deal with very elaborately in the book. The Defamation Bill, which was actually a threat to press freedom, was resisted by the journalists, not just the working journalists. And it was one moment where the press barons, those who owned the newspapers, the working journalists, those who were working in the printing press, marched together and alongside that there are the opposition MPs, very small in number, who are resisting this move in parliament. And finally Rajiv Gandhi then had to beat a retreat. And this is where the strength of the press, particularly the press, when it actually talks about deepening democracy, when it begins to play its role in deepening democracy, wherein the civil society, the political society all come together in terms of, the strengthening of the 1988 August. In fact, the 6 or 7 days between 31st of August, when the bell is introduced, I have dealt with it, on a day after day, how things unfolded in the book. And to me, that is, I think, one of the very important landmark moments in terms of the press asserting its own role, its own responsibility. And when I say role and responsibility, I'm also stressing that, the power of the press was actually sort of in full bloom. And what was the context? The context in which Rajiv Gandhi brings this is when the press was becoming investigative, when scandalous deals by the then government, particularly in defense deals, the HDW submarine deal, and subsequently the Bofors, and NRAM and the Hindu actually playing that role. Once again, sort of, the compromises between, let's say, those who were at the helm in the Hindu, that is Mr. G. Kasturi then, and Ram, who is part of the family, yet actually sort of, is not allowed to express his freedom. And perhaps the single occasion or the only occasion of significance in the history of the press in independent India, where N. Ram, an associate editor, a shareholder in the Hindu publications, is actually putting out a story, that is the Bofors story, which was not allowed by his uncle, who was then the editor, G. Kasturi, in the Hindu. This is, I'm talking about October 1988 or 89, when he is actually putting out his stories in two other newspapers, that is the Indian Express and the Statesman actually carry that story. In some sense, I think, this is the peak, or this is the most glorious moment of, let's say, a free press in India. So in some sense, yes, the retreat happens a little later. I would identify the declaration on the floor of the House, or the announcement on the floor of the House by VP Singh, then the Prime Minister, of, let's say, Mandal, one of the other legs of the First Amendment that we were talking about, that is social justice. And subsequently, the shift in the economic policy, that is what everybody calls it liberalization. In fact, I talk about it in my book also. Rather than calling it liberalization, it could be something called, I think, the most important, a better way of putting it would be the Washington Consensus, or whatever it is, which again sort of, gave a kind of, there was an illusion that now there is nothing that can actually stop India from, and then some kind of, what we call nationalism based on some kind of a pride that we are now on an onward march. That the kind of disappointment, or the kind what we can call the fear of freedom that caught the press. And this time I'm not really blaming the barons, but the fear of freedom that caught, let's say, the working journalist who belonged to the upper middle classes, who in social terms was also and continues to be those drawn from the elite, the social elite in society. That particular moment of the fear that now there is going to be a kind of a disruption was followed by this great promise of a hope. That is what, Manmohan Singh's shift, the announcement to shift in the domain of economic policy. These two things put together, to me, opened up the press turning out into a very, very promising remunerative business opportunity, something that the press commission talked about, apprehended, could be a threat to sort of, freedom and freedom of expression and the free press in India. This, I think, was a moment which led to a boom, let's say, not just in the economy, but more pronounced was the kind of boom. And that boom, insofar as the media, the press concerned, was pronounced by way of a new area of advertisement revenue opening up. The state, the government was no longer the single largest advertiser. There was, let's say, the consumer goods sector that actually, which again is something that the press commission studied very, very intensely. And a new kind of an economy, a model came in where newspapers would increase, rather sort of, inflate the circulation figures by way of reducing the cover price, even dumping newspaper copies, free copies, and so on and so forth, to make it entirely dependent on advertisement revenue. That is what the press commission talked about in 1953-54 as a major potential threat for a free press. And that is something when the press became, and I keep on talking about the press because this is also a period, particularly the early 90s, is when the business was entirely the press. Now, by the 1990s, the satellite television and subsequently the DTH boom and so on and so forth coming, and this actually changes the complexion. One is it becomes one of those sort of wonderful business propositions for everybody to sink their money, not from an altruistic point of view that the press commission talked about, but this time as a business model. Vanita Kolli-Kandekar's book is all about that, how it became a profitable business. Robin Jeffrey studies that. My thrust has been as to whether this expansion of the media and also the press as a business proposition, as a wonderful business proposition, insofar as democracy was concerned, to me, the experience has been that this again witnesses a kind of a retreat to unfreedom by the press in India. And so in some sense, the press commission did see this happening. What happened is the kind of dynamism that was made possible, the potentials for that also meant that the press had to talk about the underprivileged, those who were on the margins of the democratic experience, those who had to be sort of mainstreamed in the democratic process, which is a process that began in the 1980s, but it took some kind of a beating, particularly because this had to necessarily involve talking about the unequal social order. That is the caste system. And when we're talking about the caste system, meant that social transformation had to be sort of be the end game for the journalist, which is again something that the working journalist. So I mean, the business model in any case is a threat, but what I find more important is that the foot soldiers themselves were not really comfortable with this idea of any kind of an empowerment of those who were marginalized in the social sense. And that is where I think, the threat beginning in the 90s, or rather sort of, this pendulum swinging towards unfreedom happens in the 90s. And well, I mean, I would not say that it's end the road, but the road ahead has to be sort of it has to be a lot more different.
Yes, sorry. I think very well explained. I mean, Professor Krishna Ananth. I think you have elaborated largely. I mean, not only the arguments which you conclude your book with, but also, I mean, the major part of what happens in the post-emergency period. Now, interestingly, since I mean, your book starts, with the constant assembly debate and how freedom of speech and expression or press was also discussed, and then the First Amendment. Now, when the Constitution was amended, it was another significant amendment was on the issue of reservation. And something which you also explained, that the social order which was churning, and in fact, 80s, which the story you just explained, was also a story of redemption in the post after the emergency. I mean, the media sort of redeems itself. It's a story of defiance and resistance. Do you then also conclude that post 90, even if it in a sort of at a slow pace, gradually marks this end of camaraderie in journalism, and something which you have consistently used, working journalist, a term which we hardly find any use in the present context, in the post 90s particularly. Do you think, I mean, this camaraderie which kept the idea of press even in 75 during the emergency, even in 60s when Congress hardly had any opposition. I mean, one of the oppositional leader we could remember is Lohia, who was critical itself of the press. And then in 70s, 80s, when India went through this silent revolution of lower caste, and 90 was a culmination of these events. Does 90s, the post 90, the churning in politics, this jugalbandi, which we also see is also on the waning, the judicial jugalbandi between judiciary and press, which keeps press itself alive. Do you then think, I mean, 90s marks a gradual decline of this camaraderie of journalists across from irrespective of the proprietor or the baron?
I think, let's put it, it's not just about, the press, it's not just about the polity in India. I think post 1980s is a period of, retreat of democracy the world over. And I mean, let me take two sort of, texts that emerged in the early 1990s. One is, Francis Fukuyama's End of History, and the other is Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat. Now, Thomas Friedman was sort of, is more relevant. There was some kind of, a celebration in the 90s that, yeah, socialism is over, Soviet Union has collapsed, and the future is all about sort of, the American way of looking at history. And this is again where I think, the press in India and subsequently the media in India from 1991, the shift in the economic policy, rather sort of, the last complete burial of, Jawaharlal Nehru's idea of the Indian economy in 1991 July, marking that kind of, an approach to sort of, nation building, which is not based on, let's say, an ideal that was dreamt of. On the contrary, what I think American history is all about. That, I mean, they don't go back beyond 300 years, when they went and they killed the Indian people. They actually talk in terms of, what has America become after all? After all, America has now become, in India, we have also talked about Japan, which was destroyed in 1945, Nagasaki, Hiroshima, and how actually sort of it reconstructs itself in a sense. In some sense, like, 1991 July promised about this great future. And the Jugalbandi was also, I mean, there was a Jugalbandi between the press and the, but not in terms of, talking about the rights of the slum dwellers, not in terms of talking about the bonded labor. I talk about it in my book, in fact, and I say 1991 also marked a very important phase. And incidentally, it was the Times of India that instituted a fellowship to take, to sort of, allot a corner in the mainstream newspaper. newspapers where poverty would be discussed, where sufferings would be discussed. Incidentally, it was P. Sainath who was the recipient of the first Times Fellowship of deprivation being. So, and I actually talk about this in my book as in a crowded airport, you have a small enclosure where the smokers are allowed to go and smoke, a smoker's corner kind of a thing. So, I mean, there is, let the mainstream press, all of the press will actually talk about the greatness of a development where mines can be sort of, privatized, where the forest wealth and mineral wealth can be plundered by multinational corporations. And there
Hear you.
Yeah, so post 1991, July, and I mean, with the Times of India actually starting this whole thing. I mean, today the media scape is crowded. It's crowded with fellowships. So there are people who want to talk about poverty. They'll be given a fellowship, and they, whatever they write will also be printed and put in some corner of the newspaper, very clearly talking about this is part of a fellowship. Whereas the page one and the masthead will be sold out to people who are actually sort of, destroying the environment and so on and so forth. So, in some sense, I mean, while newspapers will probably a newspaper establishment gives a fellowship, let's say, to about net neutrality, to talk about privacy and concerns, the page one today will be sort of devoted to advertisement as to whether some privacy concerns are taken care by a particular app or a particular what we call a social media site and so on and so forth. So there is this what we can call some kind of an accommodation that takes place, which is again what we talk about the American democracy. Look, I mean, America is considered to be the greatest democracy, the most vibrant democracy. Yet, I mean, when Black lives are taken away, I mean, that democracy retreats, kind of a thing. The US society, even today, is a very, very unsafe society to people who are not white. White supremacy is something kind. In some sense, I think, this is what marks the mediascape also from the 1990s. Having said that, I mean, I think, it's, I talk about it. I talk about this particular, what do you call, development in my book also, that it's not as if like the entire mediascape is completely gone. You have, let's say, sort of, the internet platform where you have a business model that can defy, let's say, the big capital that is required. See, the press commission actually talked about the press, which in terms of capital requirement and in terms of the running cost and the operating cost, it's mind-boggling. Then comes television, which again sort of the press is much cheaper. The television, the running cost every day is sort of you need to bleed continuously. But there is this medium today, particularly sort of with the internet connectivity having expanded, which is providing the possibilities of, let's say, democratic media. I mean, you can probably run a news magazine with, let's say, like 100 or 1,000th of the money that you need to run a newspaper. But this is definitely not really in terms of sort of I call it like the parallel cinema movement. It's not the mainstream. It's still in the parallel domain, the internet media. So in some sense, when they're talking about freedom and things like that, it's now become a norm that there are a certain set of things that are talked about by some of the internet news platforms. And the mainstream press, what some others have now come with this term called the legacy media, which should have actually, which is where such issues are talked about in the 1980s, that I call about the glorious decade of the media in India, the press in India. That section of the press is no longer talking about poverty, no longer talking about an adversarial role for the press, and in that sense, democracy is weaker. But the price or the effect of all these things could be that when the media is, I mean, I will be telling a lie if I say that the media is free from it's not under pressure of the state. But I mean, that is definitely there, I think, and it's not just by way of sort of if during the emergency, the regime actually sort of, muscled and reduced the media into the press into their handmaiden by way of denying them advertisements, government advertisements. I think, I mean, what today, it is not just about advertisement. It is so many other things, because there are things that are hanky panky with every kind of business that actually can sort of, lead you to unfreedom. This is where one another important thing that the press commission talked about in the 50s was not really sort of, allowed to mature into a philosophical position by the judiciary in the Sakal newspaper case, the pages in the price schedule, and the need for a horizontal spread of, let's say, media. In other words, more and more localization of the media, more and more small coming into the game. I think, these are concerns that have to sort of, be. And this is the lesson that, I think, we need to learn. And that's what I try to say in my book.
Yeah, I mean, Professor Krishna Ananth has given us, I think, I mean, then this, yes, I mean, in the last uh, discussion also, and today also, wonderfully the glimpses of his book, and which I would recommend, I mean, all of you to buy this book, Freedom, from Freedom, Between Freedom to Unfreedom, the history of press in independent India. I think, I mean, Professor Anand has already explained in much detail uh, this, you know, the journey of press in the post-independent India, and more importantly, the discussion in the last two discussion with the Professor Anand makes it essential to read this book, and for one of the primary reason, which at least, I mean, I had read this book and bought it also, uh, to to in fact to have some sense of this debate which is currently going around, where the media is either seen as has reached a certain kind of end. The role of press in a democratic India, uh, the role of press in a democratic India has reached its end, of its end, or either it is seen as that, the state for the first time in the independent history has, created a certain kind of atmosphere where press cannot function independently. And in fact, Professor Anand's book actually, I mean, on the contrary, tells us that media has gone through this so many times. I mean, whether it is 75 emergency, 60s, 80s, and then 90s, and have found, strength within the discipline, within the institution to overcome it. And the times in which it has failed is actually to do with this, dilemma, whether media or in fact press, is a can one, it has to strive as a business model, while keeping in mind and reminding itself the historical role of the press is to not to undermine democracy, but in fact to strengthen the democracy in various roles, whether it was in 80 as a crusader, whether it is in the 60s, or whether it is about, the one basic fact which in 75, which Professor Krishnan sort of tells us, is informing people that your constitutional rights are being taken away. So let me thank, I mean, Professor Krishna Anand, who has taken, I mean, took this time of and have this, discussion with us. And we hope that we could have Professor Anand again at this platform at AtheNEum. And we would love to have you again, sir. Thank you so much for having this
Thank you very
discussion with
much.
us.
I also enjoyed this. Thank you very much.
And I mean, the description and the link for this book will be given below. And I highly recommend, I mean, you can go and buy the book, Between Freedom and Unfreedom: The History of Press in Independent India. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us at Athenium.
If you like what we're doing and wish to see more such content, please like, share, and subscribe to AtheNEum.